Hi.
Hello.
So we're in the beginning of the conversation, so maybe we can talk a bit about how you start your
Mm,
career, and maybe you can tell us about also how the climate change world looked like when
mm,
you started.
mm. Hi, everyone. Well, on the topic of hope, I just wanted to say I'm so happy to be here in Bucharest. I had hoped to come here back in 2020 to report on Romanians and bears from my book. The pandemic interrupted that. I had hoped to speak here last year on bears, but unfortunately, my dad had suffered a stroke, so I had to cancel that trip too. So thank you, Christian, for helping me to realize my hope finally of coming to Romania. I'm very grateful. Yeah, so on the topic of my career covering environmental issues and climate change. So I grew up in southwestern Ontario in Canada, in a city of about 300,000 people, not much nature. I'm sure many people here too are from the city or the suburbs. And my family was not very outdoorsy. We didn't go hiking, we didn't go camping. There were no bears, but I did love reading National Geographic magazine and watching nature documentaries. And my grandparents lived near the Rocky Mountains in Canada, so kind of my only experience with nature at that time was to go out to visit them a couple summers during my childhood. And we were talking at that time that my mom would put me on a leash when we went into the woods because she was so afraid that I would be attacked by a bear and I would run ahead. So I think in some ways my career has kind of been a form of rebellion against that those chains, as it were. But yeah, so I kind of was like, huh, I love nature, I loved reading, I hated math, so that kind of ruled out becoming a wildlife biologist. And yeah, I decided to pursue a career in environmental journalism, and I think when I was going through high school and growing up, my perception of that was I would cover poaching, I would cover nature loss, but climate change really hadn't kind of entered the vernacular yet. I think my first memory of being exposed to that was Al Gore's documentary An Inconvenient Truth, and even then, like, I had no idea that that would come to kind of define my life. I moved to Colorado in the US when I was 22. And at that time, I think kind of around 2012, like it was a growing topic. There were bad wildfires, bad hurricanes, melting ice. It was becoming more and more common. But even then, like my program in environmental journalism was for people, and I think it was one of the only universities that offered a specialty in this. It was still not mainstreamed in that way. And I think going back to this idea of hope, kind of the formative moment of moving out of school and into the world was the 2015 UN Paris Climate Agreement. And I had just graduated. Obama was president in the US. I went to the Paris climate talks and looking back, I'm like, I guess this was youthful optimism, but I was so hopeful. And it was very strange in some ways to start your career in environmental journalism on such a high point. And I look back now and I've heard scientists say even at that time, like the fight for climate change was already lost. I mean, we were going to pass 1.5 degrees of warming at that time. But I just remember leaving Paris and being like, wow, like we did it. And I think ever since then, the past 10 years obviously has been a very, very different story.
Yeah, let's talk about that a bit too, because some years have passed, things have changed. Now we know that there's a bit of hope, a bit more of hopelessness in the 1.5 and 2 degrees limit. So how do you see, do you think the world is losing hope in tackling climate change, or we still can do something?
Anecdotally, I think a lot of climate and environmental reporters have been aware that there's been a decline in interest in climate stories in the past few years. It wasn't until a few weeks ago that I saw data that really crystallized that. So 2021 was kind of the peak of climate coverage, which I thought was a bit surprising given the pandemic. I wasn't, I think people were probably talking about emissions, perhaps the fact that despite the world shutting down, emissions hadn't really dropped. But since 2021, we've seen a decline of around 38% in climate stories in the media. And even just between year on year, between last year, 2024 and 2025, it dropped another 14% just in that time period. And I think the common explanation for this has been just the world is facing so many more immediate crises. That's something I hear a lot, right? Of course, how can you think about nature and climate when we are facing, 2, if not 3 wars. Trump in the America and Trump has made rolling back climate protections and environmental protections a key part of his agenda, but it hasn't received as much attention as his other aspects of domestic and foreign policy. And sometimes that phrase bothers me a bit that we have more immediate crises because I think, we've talked about wars can come to an end. They come to end in years, if not decades, but there is typically an end. And maybe those wars come back, but you have periods of peace. And I think how climate and environmental reporters feel right now is yes, climate is a more slow-moving crisis in many ways, but the impacts cannot so easily be ended. They cannot so easily be reversed, right? Once a species is extinct, you can't bring it back. Once we pass 1.5, which we are guaranteed to do, once we perhaps pass 2 degrees, trying to rein in the climate, trying to bring it back to the state that it once was, is all but impossible. It cannot be easily remedied. So we are kind of turning attention away at a really critical time, it feels, for this fight. And something we discussed too is, I feel like I've been hearing for the past 15 years, these next 5 years are going to decide the future. And I've been hearing that phrase of the next 5 years since I was 20 years old. So what does that mean for hope now that we're still saying this? But yeah, I think the question of like whether or not we've lost hope for climate change is a difficult one to answer. I think during times of crisis, nature sometimes feels like a luxury. It's not something that we have the time to think about. I like to think more so perhaps that people are just distracted. It's not a loss of hope and that the media will come back and people will come back to this when we have time. I think the question is just, will it be too late? And I do think that we've perhaps lost hope in the methods that we thought would work to tackle climate change. I think that we've lost hope in some ways in government policy being strong enough to make this change on our behalf. And we need to start thinking about different ways that we might be able to address these issues.
Yeah, and to continue on these ideas, we're also in the state of disbelief. Also, we're turning away more and more from news. We're more and more in our phone, and it feels like a big disconnect between people and nature in the last couple of years, at least as I see it, at least in the big cities. So I was wondering, in these times that we're facing, for now, we still have wars. We still have, of course, a lot of political problems. Um, what ways do you see, maybe new or old ways or certain subjects that we can touch to connect more people with nature and with the subjects that are so important and so hard to document sometimes, because talking about the climate crisis, you can't put a finger on it. So it's always so hard to take a picture that illustrates something
Mm.
bad. So yeah,
I think,
disconnect and reconnect.
yeah, people feel very, I guess, abstracted from nature often in their daily lives. People in cities, people who are making decisions, positions of power. I think, for me, it's interesting to think about this idea of like nature and hope as well, because I find I personally feel the most positive and hopeful in my life when I'm in nature. And it's interesting, like, not necessarily that I'm thinking being hopeful about the future of nature itself, but hopeful perhaps in other aspects of life when things are hard, right? I turn to nature. And I think it's complicated too. People tend to define nature as like vast wilderness, bears as like very pure nature too, right? But I think it can also be smaller. It can be a park or a garden and things like that. And to that, I think people feel less disconnected. They just don't always define it in the way that broader society defines it. But for my own work, I mean, you mentioned all of the animals that I've had the opportunity to cover, and I was also very much an
I
animal
don't know
kid.
if I missed any.
There was one that you did miss, but I will. I'll bring it. I'll bring it to you after. Um, yeah, I was someone who always connected most with nature, even when I didn't feel like I had much through animals. And we had talked about too, like most people, perhaps they don't think of themselves as environmentalists or pushing for these changes, but they do like animals. I've yet to meet someone who just like hates all wildlife. And so for me, they might be afraid of sharks. Like, where is that? I don't hate them, but
Can't see them, so it's
it's
creepy.
very scary. So for me, I mean, as a writer and as a journalist, I've typically turned to animals as kind of a vehicle to connect with people and to tell broader stories about climate change, about deforestation, topics that sound quite boring, but to kind of give it that face and that spirit in my work.
Okay, so you think animals can be like this connector between,
They're
the
easy stories for people to understand, I think, right? We grow up with a lot of stories of animals in various incarnations. And if you want to talk to someone about emissions, that sounds quite boring. But if you want to tell someone a story about a polar bear, they might listen to you.
true. Now, talking about polar bears and other types of bears, getting to my favorite part, our favorite part of the conversation. Gloria will also have a book signing tomorrow, and now I want to tap in. Well, the book is a result of many years of research on the subject, but why bears to begin with? From all the animals I just listed, you documented.
It wasn't necessarily so clear to me, I think, that my life would revolve, or at least the last 10 years would revolve around bears. And sometimes I think I feel a bit guilty too, because there's a lot of criticism about environmental writers who focus on the most popular species. It's kind of like you should be writing about like a slug or something. But to me, I mean, I am guilty. They're very cute, and they also have this duality of they're also quite scary to some people. And I think we have a very complicated relationship with bears that makes them a really useful test case for conservation of other animals, right? This is an animal that is extremely adorable, and we look at bear memes and we share cute stories of bears. And they're also capable of killing us. So there's this really interesting kind of love-hate tension when we tell stories about bears, about what it could do to us. I think I was mentioning too. There's one of my favorite jokes on the internet is someone who says, if I was getting attacked by a bear, I would sneak in a pet real quick, right? Like, and that kind of perfectly, I think, summarizes the issues that I explore in my book. But yeah, I just think they're such a dynamic animal. People relate to them. For my own personal story with bears, I had moved to Colorado to the Rocky Mountains when I was doing my master's, and I just noticed Romania has this too now, but there were no bear-proof garbage bins. And I thought that that
I
was
know that
quite,
story too.
yes, quite strange. And at the time, bears were coming into the town and they were being shot and killed by the police because they were attracted to the garbage. And so I just began looking into that. And then I just kept doing more and more bear stories. And I kept discovering more interesting ways that humans and bears intersected. And I think eventually I just Googled how many bears are there. Because I don't know, I thought there was maybe four, and it said 8 bears. And I was like, oh, that's a really convenient number to write about.
Talking about bears being these adorable creatures that can also kill, and about our roles as journalists, um, how did you tackle, also in the book, but maybe also in the articles you wrote before, how did you tackle this balance between l- light and hopelessness, the light and dark in your reporting and writing? Because yeah, you have to tell about the problems and about the killings, but we know there are also some conservation efforts. So how do you feel your responsibility to balance that is waiting upon you?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges when writing about and the environment, biodiversity, so much of it is very depressing and at times very cruel too. My book essentially takes you across the world to look at the threats facing the 8 remaining species of bears. So we go from biofarming in Southeast Asia, which is for traditional Chinese medicine. Bears are kept in these very tight cages for many years, if not decades, so that their bile can be harvested. So it's a very upsetting thing to see. And most people don't really want to spend their recreational time reading about animal cruelty and welfare issues like that. When you look at the polar bear, I mean, this is an animal that more or less it seems like hope has been lost for its future once we lose the sea ice. Again, like how do you convince people to read really depressing material and not completely lose hope and turn away? And so, I mean, when I was working through the book, it was kind of always trying in some ways to soften the blow in terms of, I would have this really depressing chapter about biofarming, but then we'd go to China and look at the pandas being cute and all the things that have gone well. You're kind of always oscillating between these two themes. But it's funny, I mean, I don't always think about hope that much as a journalist, and maybe we'll get to this more later, but I remember when I was working on the book and speaking with my editor, I was very concerned about kind of wrapping up the book in a way that was just like, "But there's still hope," and I felt this was a very yeah, it was a very
Forced.
forced and fake and glib kind of reaction to you've just painted a really dire picture of what's happening to the world's animals, and then to kind of wrap it up for readers by just being like, oh, well, don't worry too much because you don't want them to feel bad or to lose hope. Like that's a very it's a kind of a tight line to walk. And I think especially in kind of American writing, there's always this like very knee-jerk reaction to like give readers that false sense of hope, even if it might not exist at the end. And I think that as the world has gotten measurably worse in the last 10 years, like that reaction has diminished somewhat. But I said I want it to be a very honest kind of conclusion and ending. And for that, I kind of paint this picture of, I think there's 3 bears probably of the 8 bears that have a kind of very hopeful future in this world, and for the rest, like, unless things dramatically change, then we've lost them and we didn't do enough. But yeah, it's hard. I mean, I sometimes look at reviews of my book online, of course, and yeah, sometimes people say I had to stop reading, it was too upsetting. And what service does that do for conservation if people can't stand to read it at all?
And tapping in a bit more in the subject of conservation and coexistence, I want to ask you something related to our context. So I'm going to give a bit of context for the non-Romanians in the room. I don't know, maybe you heard or not. We have some of our conflicts here too. We have like the most bears in Europe, between 10,000 and 13,000 out of 20,000, without counting Russia. We did a study. Most or a part of the scientific world is contesting that, but for sure we have a lot of bears and people are concerned. And we have taken a lot of emotional decisions regarding to, of course, they're a protected species by the European Union. But in the last couple of years, we've taken measures like now we can kill some hundreds of them. So we made some big exceptions because a person was killed tragically in our mountains. And of course, it's a tragic story. But it's one case. So we drive, whenever there's a story regarding these animals, when something bad happens, we rely on emotions and not on statistics. And yeah, so it's a constant battle between conservationists and hunters and local people who, again, have some losses from their animals that are killed by bears. So I think my question is, from your reporting for the book and from your decade, more than one decade now, I think, what do you feel we can learn about coexistence between humans and bears? Because you read also more about bears in Romania. Maybe you have a perspective on this.
One of the things that had attracted to me to Romania so much is what you said. Like, you have this enormous population of brown bears in a relatively small area where a lot of people also live. And that's not really found to the same extent in Canada and the United States. I mean, people living around Yellowstone in the US, they make a big deal about living alongside 1,500 or so grizzly bears. I think the idea of coexisting with 13,000 would be like blow their minds. They just could not. They could not do it. So I'm very careful of kind of preaching to people who probably know a lot better than I do about the local circumstances here. But I will say, I mean, maybe I should summarize where bears live in the world for people too. So
Sure.
there's a lot of bears that people don't know. I mean, there's sloth bears that live in India. There's a spectacled bear that lives in the Andes in South America. There's a sun bear and the moon bear, which live in Asia. And something that I think I've found a lot in my work when it comes to coexistence is that stories are really important. The stories that we tell about bears in our cultures really shape people's interactions and views of them into their adult life. I mean, I talk in my book about, people have teddy bears, right? Like one of the first forms that we encounter typically in this world is a bear. The stories that were read as children tend to position bears as a much more benign force
Than other animals.
than other animals, right? I mean, when I would travel throughout a lot of Western North America, I would hear so much hatred towards wolves from ranchers. Of course, the wolves were coming and killing their sheep or killing their cows, But bears were doing that to some extent too, but there was just a much kinder sentiment towards bears than the wolves in their backyards. And I think, again, we were talking, you have Red Riding Hood, you have the Three Little Pigs, the wolf is the villain. And in the most famous story in Western culture that we have about bears, the bears are the victims of Goldilocks, who comes into their house and breaks their chairs and sleeps in their bed and steals the porridge. And the bears are like the very nice characters, right? So I think like it's so interesting the extent to which just having these stories from an early age guides conservation later on. And for cultures that perhaps lack those stories, they can be more aggressive towards bears or more negative. And then that's obviously not to say that when someone is attacked and killed by a bear, you don't have this outpouring of emotion and anger. But I think it makes an easier path to set up community conservation and coexistence to begin with. And it also helps that bears are very cute. So
And another question on this subject, it's something that we've been talking to also for the last couple of days, and it's like bugging me a lot also in my normal reporting, because I think you said it happened to you too. Going somewhere, asking questions on conservation, coexistence, being the person from the city, and people saying, you can't understand the damages. Of course, you want to write a story about coexistence. You're from the city, it doesn't affect you. So we become, or I feel sometimes I'm this outsider who is open and curious to understand, but still you're seen as the, I know, some sort of a bad guy that doesn't understand their situation and has no right of coming into their community and telling them, what the researchers said we should preserve, blah blah blah. So I'm wondering if you, in your reporting, if you can understand who from the people you talk to, who gets to decide what and when to conserve bears or other species. What is your conclusion after
I think it's a really
this?
fair point. I mean, and I'm sure you feel the same. You feel pressure to kind of blend in when you go to these places, that you're not another person coming from a city telling them what they should do. And I would probably feel the same way if I had someone once say to me, every time I leave the house, I kind of have to look to see if there's a bear in the driveway. If I let my child to go out to play, I have to look to see if there's bears there, or I've lost my livelihood to this bear. So I sympathize with that, and it's true. Like the laws of conservation are typically made in cities. I think you see the sentiment reflected when a hiker is killed, as we've had in Romania, right? It's like this transgression where someone from a city perhaps went to recreate and they were killed. And it's like this very captivating and horrific story to people who live in cities, like hikers killed by bears, where the reality is, yeah, people who are working as farmers or ranchers, they're dealing with attacks on themselves or on their livestock all the time. I think perhaps one of like the stronger arguments is the fact that generally simply killing and removing problem bears doesn't really make a big difference when you look at the data in terms of what happens, that there's better ways to coexist. That are, is not just resorting to hunting. We've seen, I think we'll get to this, but some really good programs across different parts of the world that focus on, community intervention as opposed to tranquilizing and moving bears. Bears are very smart. They tend to get back to where they're from anyway, or simply killing those bears from a population, removing them. So I think trying to engage people in what other options are there is maybe one of the most hopeful and important things that we can do. And we've seen really big changes in some places too that were hotspots of attacks and that have been kind of transformed through these processes.
Yeah, we definitely have to talk a bit about that too. Relocation for Romania for sure doesn't work. All the specialists are saying, they're coming back. So now basically the only solution we have, besides killing them if they're really aggressive and they come multiple times in villages, is to move them to this sanctuary we have near Brasov. So the sanctuary that was for saving animals from the circus now has become also a place for wild bears to come, because they're very smart and they come back. But we have also a good example in Băile Tușnad, where, as you were saying about communities that are starting to move things around a bit in the last couple of years. The mayor there said last year that the numbers to our 911, 112 dropped from like 100 and something or over almost 200 in the last couple of years to a few, like under 10, because they made like a better local squad that can intervene. So locals, when there's a bear in the communities, they call them, and yeah, it's everything is more manageable locally. They don't have to involve the national emergency services. Yeah, and they cut the. We were talking in the last couple of days. They cut the trees, the fruit trees,
Yeah.
for them not to come so often. So I wonder if we can you can tell us a bit about the solution, some concrete solutions that you found in your reporting from America, from Canada. I'm sure I know you have
Yeah, I mean, I guess this
examples.
is kind of where my bear reporting had started too, is
Yeah.
just this question of why aren't people locking their garbage away? It's one of the easiest ways to reduce conflicts with bears. And so seeing that kind of, they call them bear smart communities. The place that I lived to, bears were often coming into town. They would eat fruit, they would eat apple trees, they'd fall asleep in the trees. And they had this group called the bear sitters, of people who would volunteer to sit underneath the trees where the bears and their cubs were and just kind of keep people clear with pots and pans and kind of keeping the line between, wildlife and humans very distinct and clear. And we've kind of seen over the past decade of some of these methods moving across the world, right? I mean, I'm not to say like, oh, they invented this, but there were places in Canada that were doing this for a long time. And now, as more and more people are living alongside bears, they're kind of disseminating this method elsewhere. One of the stories I've been looking at lately is in Japan, where there were 13 people killed by bears last year. And that's tied also to, it's a climate story. Their food in the mountains failed, and they went into towns in search of, garbage, in search of fruit trees. 13 people were ultimately killed, hundreds were attacked. The Japanese government called in the military, and they've killed thousands of bears in just 1 year's time to respond to that. But Japan is a place that only has one bear smart community, right? So they have no coexistence measures. They did nothing proactive, and their solution has been just to kill bears by the thousands in response. So I think there are ways to do this much better. I think it's better to do it beforehand than after, because humans are very emotional animals, right? We are very reactive. If someone is attacked and killed, it makes it harder to try to implement those measures after, beyond just resorting to shooting bears. But yeah, I also wanted to ask you, like, I mean, I have not hiked alone in Romania. I'm curious, like, the fear that you feel when you're here thinking about these stories. How do you react to that?
I keep saying that for me at least, I don't think the fear or a dose of fear ever goes away. I mean, I carry some fear with me, but I think I got used to it hiking in the mountains for over 20 years. And, I think I see it more as a privilege because I'm so used to passing. I feel like I'm passing through their home, and it's a privilege. I mean, for me, nature is not just nature looking at a tree and not having any other creatures in the forest. Okay, I know we have problems and we have to deal with them, and we're starting to deal with them a bit better in Romania, a bit. But yeah, I feel it like a privilege, and I had encounters with bears, but fortunately, all of them resided with them running in a way and me in the other, because in the end they're wild creatures. And yeah, but one of our problems here, and we don't have an answer who should do something about it, is we lack education on the measures part. I mean, if you go to our national natural parks, most of them don't have. You're gonna see the signs "Beware, we have bears," but you're not gonna see some couple of rules. Yeah, Tushnad is doing it now, which is very important. But I don't know if in the States or in Canada all the parks have or not have this type of education boards. But I think for us would be necessary to have that, and people would be less afraid, because also the media plays a role in it. And all the headlines, shocking, another person dead, crime at the foot of the mountain, stuff like. So our reputation is also suffering. So I think it's a connection between lack of education and distrust in the media, because the media is some of the media in Romania and other parts of the world are using these headlines.
that you don't hear, as you said, about every single time someone saw a bear and it just ran away, right? We're hearing
Yeah.
about the most grisly attacks, and that can make it harder for people to support conservation.
Yeah, and we also have these we call it now like garbage bears. We had a problem on
Mm.
a popular road in Romania, Transfăgărășan, and for many years we were wondering, why are people stopping? Why are people feeding them? I mean, yeah, so it's a mix of lack of education. I think some people don't really understand the dangers, and it's not only their fault. Of course, you shouldn't feed a bear, but no one is repeating to you somewhere that you should
I think
feed the
too, like
bear.
what I've found in my reporting, not just on bears around the world, but other species too, and other environmental issues, is just like how, I mean, yes, the context differs to some extent between places, but just how common the issues that we face are. You know, there's people in India who are living alongside sloth bears. They're the most aggressive bear in the world. They kill the most people each year, but a lot of the solutions are quite similar, right? It's like the garbage bears exist in Lake Tahoe in California, right? We see that in Canada. We see that in Japan. Like we have the same problems, but we don't always speak to each other about solutions and share that. And I think that that's perhaps the next step here.
Yeah, and talking about solutions and coming back a bit to hope, and I can't get out of my head this part of, only 3 species of bears
Mm.
would survive out of 8 until the end of the century. And I think it's for us at least as reporters in this world is, I mean, it's a heavy information to take in, talking
Mm.
about extinctions. So I was wondering, what do you think your role, our role today in the media, the landscape today, is to provide hope as journalists when you know all you know
Mm.
about the world and everything else that's happening outside the environmental world?
It's been interesting this morning to hear how many people kind of were affronted by Christians' sharing of the theme of hope, right? To a bunch of journalists. And I had the exact same reaction when I heard the theme this year. And I think part of it is that, I mean, journalists tend to lean towards cynicism. I don't think that I would not describe many of my friends in the media as very hopeful people. I'd say they have a great sense of dark humor, but not that they're optimistic, hopeful people. And I think it makes you reflect a lot more onto what is the role of a journalist. And I think to me, I've always thought, my primary purpose as a storyteller and a journalist is to provide the truth and to provide honesty. And whether or not there's hope to be found in that is kind of up to the reader, but it's not my job to create a sense of hope if it's not there. But it creates this very difficult situation to be in too, because I mean, in some ways, it feels like the purpose of humanity is to be hopeful, right? Especially in these
Actually,
times.
no.
Stories have provided hopes for millennia and generations, and you need that too. So I think that this has kind of made me rethink some of my thoughts at first, right? Just kind of being like, oh, it just matters to be honest, just matters to be truthful. But what, and I think that's still, of course, very important, but more in these longer stories when we have the opportunity to kind of reflect and be more philosophical, how to best go about that too. Yeah, I think it's just a hard time right now when there's so much going on to find those sources of hope. But when we were speaking again and kind of reflecting on, well, what have I actually I think it's so easy to kind of lose sight of successes and things that work, of solutions, right? And you're just kind of focused on the negative in your work and your reporting. And you actually think, oh, actually I did see this or I did read this. And maybe it's a bit more nuanced than that. Yeah.
So, so you feel like hope is gonna be a bit of an extra lens, maybe in
Mm.
your future reporting,
Yeah, I
like
think
looking
too.
for some things that might work also in the doom
Sometimes I
scenarios.
think when you're confronted with bad things, I mean, you kind of want, like, to what kind of, I mean, the hope is a waste without action, right? What Mikhail said, like, I think that that's so important. So how do you create that? I think for a long time, I thought if people felt perhaps a bit guilty or shameful, does that inspire action, right? People feel like they have no agency and no control over these very large processes, especially changing the climate back. um, they feel disempowered in their own life, right? So, and I guess that's where storytelling can perhaps again create that power.
Yes, and yeah, going back to the part of you can't reverse climate change, of course, but do you see some new perspectives on how to tackle the subject from your talks with scientists and the scientific world in general? Is there a glimpse of, I don't know, a new way of looking at things?
One of the biggest shifts has been, I mean, I mentioned at the start that when I did my master's in environmental journalism, there were 4 people in that program, right? So I think the first shift that we've seen is how many more young people are engaged in the environment, in climate change, who went through school with some form of education on this. And I think that they've not kind of yet reached those greater halls of power, but when they do, we might see a big change in terms of the policy aspect of things. I think the big kind of gap right now is that things have to happen quite fast in the next 5 years, allegedly. um, and so that's the hard part of this. And again, I think people have lost faith in governments resolving this issue at this time. I think for me, you know, one of the stories that I did recently was looking at Gen Z scientists and engineers who were starting to look into climate engineering, which is a scary phrase for a lot of people. But I still found that to be a bit of a hopeful story in the sense that this generation that has, kind of taken on so much of older generations' issues, they still have not lost hope. They're still looking, is there another way into this problem? They haven't given up. And so I find like looking at those sorts of stories to be quite refreshing. And another one, we had talked to you about, when I was writing the book, the chapter on polar bears. I mean, every single scientist I spoke with said to me, polar bears must have the sea ice. They can't live without sea ice. They can't adapt to living on land. So once we lose the ice, that is the end of polar bears. And that, that's kind of how I ended the book was, we're staring down the barrel of extinction for this species. And then a few weeks ago, or a month ago now, a new study came out about a population of polar bears in Svalbard that had in fact adapted to being able to eat reindeer. And it's kind of upended what scientists thought. I mean, obviously it's a small sample size. We don't know what the outcome is, but it maybe we will lose the sea ice, but maybe there is more hope for adaptation, right? Like hope doesn't just have to be changing emissions, it can also be in how we adapt and how we change our lives to match these circumstances. And maybe that's more of a hopeful story.
I think that's a great ending for our talk. So I just want to also share a bit of news, a hopeful news from Romania that I found out last night because also Gen Z needs to be the Gen Z that want to be reporters now. I think they have to be encouraged also more and more to report on this world. So for that you need finances, and for the first time, like in ever, I found like some scholarships that a group of scientists are giving for 1 full year to document stories on the environment, and I think that's an important thing for us because we don't have like journalism schools that tackle climate change as it is today. So tomorrow Gloria will have a book signing and after lunch, and I invite you all to don't be shy and talk to her because we listed all the animals she wrote about and all the topics. So thank you very much, and I'll leave you to our lunch break.
Thank you.